Welcome to the first ever podcast from Restoration Matters titled Restoring Relationships. I'm David Whitlock. I'll be your host for this podcast, and with me is Lynne Lang.
I am so glad that we're here with our listeners on this maiden voyage of this podcast series. I'm excited to see it unfold, and I'm looking forward to this first one, David. So what will we do today?
With the theme of restoring relationships, I wanted to choose something personal to me, and something that was given to me by my dad a while back is a book of sermons I have with me today from my grandfather.
So the broken relationship, when we talk about restoring relationships, did you know your grandfather, or did he pass away before you even came into the world?
He passed away before I was born. I believe it was the 70s. I should know, really, because it's my own grandpa. But it was a few years after my parents were married. None of us grandkids of his got to know him on any sort of a personal level. One thing I have here, and I've read through this book of sermons before, but not too recently. I want to get to know my grandpa. I want to build a relationship, or see if I can build a relationship with my grandpa Whitlock from his sermons.
I think that's a great idea. And I think especially when we think about restoring relationships, maybe we have people in our lives right now that we would like to restore relationships with, broken by conflict of some kind. And this is a beautiful way of thinking about restoring a relationship, because I can't imagine that this wouldn't bring you also closer to your dad.
It's definitely an experiment. I've definitely taken a lot from reading, and this first sermon is from December 17th, 1963.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's around the time of the Kennedy assassination. I can tell you what kind of car my family was driving. We had an old Ford Galaxy 500 salmon pink station wagon that hauled 4 kids around.
Yeah, this should bring back nostalgia, because it is definitely, he was speaking in that era. He was a Methodist minister. This sermon was given at Aldersgate Church, Angeles, PI.
PI. Well, where was that?
1900 hours.
My goodness, this guy was really precise. What town was it? And was he the pastor of the church?
You know, those are great questions. I haven't done enough research. Let me get into it here. The art of self-giving is what my grandpa, Harold Whitlock, I guess it's worth saying his name right. Harold Whitlock, again, served in the Army. And this is one of the sermons that he gave at the base, entitled The Art of Self-Giving. He has John 3:16. Are you familiar with John?
For God so loved the world that, yes.
Yeah, is that a popular?
It's very popular. In fact, I think that's probably the most primary salvation scripture that gets quoted. So if you don't know it, go look up John 3:16.
And in the season of hope, I can't think of a better passage. This was December 17th, 1963. Without any further ado, let me read a few paragraphs in here from the sermon of my grandpa. God gave of himself, and the Son gave of himself. And if we would be of his followers, we too must learn the wonderful art of self-giving. It is one spark of divine character we are privileged to reproduce. An elderly merchant, speaking to a young businessman, said, "You are at the stage where you are thinking of life in terms of achieving, of getting started, and that is normal and proper at your age. The time will come when you will think of life in terms of giving instead of getting, when you will get more satisfaction from what you can give of yourself than from what you can get for yourself. And when that happens, you will be a mature man. The mark of maturity is the willingness and the ability to give of yourself."
There's so many things out there that speak to this generativity, this point in our lives where we have to give back, because we've had so much abundance of people that have gone before us. I think this is a beautiful way of saying that self-giving makes us grown up. It grows us up. And I love that as an opener for a sermon.
and the ability to give of yourself. I challenge myself to act in mature ways, and I feel there's a lot of truth in there. Of course, maturity definitely, I think, links in generosity.
When I think about just you as a father having young children, how much you sacrifice and give for them, that idea on a level of parent to child is one way of seeing it. I think it's, though, also that spirit of giving in the community. And I'm sure that his church was built on self-giving.
Let me continue here. There are two main obstacles in the way of self-giving. One is shyness, and the other is reserve. You know what shyness is: timidity about meeting new people, about saying what you feel, about joining the conversation. Psychiatrists have made an unpleasant discovery about adult shyness. We used to think that shyness was the mark of a modest, humble person, but not so, say the psychiatrists. Shyness is the mark of a person who is thinking too much about himself. The shy person is nervous about meeting strangers, trembles and perspires in a crowd because he is self-conscious. He tries to blend into the background because he doesn't want to be embarrassed, and feels sure he is afraid someone will think him stupid or foolish. The shy person really wants to shine, but he fears failure. What a terrible picture that is. Yet we know that if we are thinking about something else, trying to put him at ease, trying to make him feel important, shyness disappears. Or when we are caught up in an important idea and have a conviction about it, we forget all fears about what others may think of us and present that idea without shyness.
I never thought about shyness as a person who thinks too much of themselves. I think that's a brilliant way of thinking about shyness. I always thought about humility, putting others before ourselves, which is a wonderful virtue. But the idea of shyness, I think about how many children I work with in schools who suffer from anxiety, and it is the fear of failure and a lack of confidence. And so the more we encourage then, the more we live a life of self-giving to others, we build them up and we put them before ourselves. We can relieve that anxiety or that sense of shyness that they have by building them up.
And I've also found a lot in virtue education, and my grandpa makes a point here, there are two main obstacles in the way of self-giving, in the way of personal generosity: shyness and reserve. In virtue, the opposite is not always the thing that takes away. In this case, the obstacle to generosity is shyness and reserve. Shyness and reserve on their own, I wouldn't categorize those things as evil, right?
Right.
But to have obstacles to generosity, well, that's something different. It's harder to kind of fine tune virtue in this sense. I found that very interesting, mulling over it, that shyness and reserve. So I'm curious to see, let me read on about what he has to say about how reserve becomes an obstacle to self-giving. Reserve now is a little different from shyness. It is more deliberate and planned. We know some modern Stoics who regard any type of emotion as weakness, and therefore steel themselves to hide their feelings. Instead of sensitive expression, they develop poker faces and never give them away. Of course, some people go to the other extreme, into extravagant ecstasies or agonies at the slightest provocation. There is a happy medium. Most of us would be more attractive personalities if we expressed our feelings more freely than we do. Isn't this what makes a child an endless delight? If he likes you, he lets you know it, comes running to meet you, eyes dancing, places his hand in yours, and skips by your side. He gives himself without reserve. Hopefully you can forgive me in some of these spots. This was done on a typewriter, 1960s technology. I can see where my grandpa didn't want to redo the whole page, so some of the words are lacking spaces, just a few. And then there's a 3-hole punch system for this book. Lynn can see it here with me. Some words are punched out, but I'll do my best.
Some of the type is faded on it, and it definitely is been weathered with time, but I think it is a priceless jewel to hear this, especially in the 60s. When I think about the affect theory, I don't know if our listeners know anything about the affect theory, but our affect is how our face looks. What is it that people see when they look at us? And that idea of a poker face is that there is no expression, there is no emotion there. He's actually saying at a time when people were less demonstrative of their emotions, he's saying that's not the way we should live our lives. I think that's very countercultural for the 60s. I love the idea of unreserved joy and unreserved connections in relationships between children and adults. And I think that's the very thing that counteracts shyness and timidity. So this guy was really ahead of his time.
I'm glad you can say the word timidity. I have confidence saying timidity now that you correctly said timidity. Thank you for that. Yeah, and poker face, we still use that term nowadays too. That definitely still translates 60 plus years later. All right, let me continue. Some people are reserved because they have been hurt. Some overture of the past has been rebuffed, and they have said never again. They don't want to get involved with others because their lives may become complicated. So the reserved person keeps himself. He does not give of himself, and his life becomes cold and cheerless, empty and futile.
Wow. Think about people we know that are like that.
This month for December, we look at hope as a virtue, and I'm thinking about some of our descriptors or what a person who lacks hope. And in this sense, what my grandpa is setting up is that to be too reserved, to be too guarded, is how someone gets into that cold place. Is that it is willful. You know, it's willful to be hopeful, but it's also willful to be reserved.
Absolutely. This is a whole new spin on Scrooge. When we think about the time-honored story of the Christmas of past, the ghost of past, present, and future, and how those things really affect a person reflecting on their lives and seeing them in a different perspective. This idea of coldness and reserve is something that we certainly would like to encourage people to see in a new light.
Life becomes cold, cheerless, empty, and futile. He always paints a picture with his words, but he really drove that home.
Yes.
Let me continue here. The world is full of people who need sympathy, affection, and appreciation more than they need anything else. Yet our shyness or reserve keeps us from giving it to them. There are a few times I have spoken out when I should have kept quiet, but there are 10 times as many times when through timidity I kept silent when I should have spoken. We see someone in deep trouble and our heart goes out to them, but we choke back the impulse to express our sympathy. We are afraid of being misunderstood or of becoming involved. And comfort is denied the person who needs it most. We could have given ourselves, but we did not.
Boy, is that ever true. I think about times when I maybe am in a store or in some public place and I see interaction between either two adults or a parent and a child. And I think, what could I do in that moment when they're obviously not happy with each other? What could I do to step in? Or even a person alone. There's a place near our house, it's a bike trail, and every time I go by, I didn't realize it until I was actually walking one day, and there's a man there who literally lives in the shelter outside. And I didn't know. I thought he was just a man sitting there journaling the first time I saw him. But then I started realizing every time I went by, the man was still there. And it's been on my mind. This sermon is bringing to mind something that I know I need to do, which is to go and offer companionship. I think this is a really great message, a timely message for the time we live in now.
We could give of ourselves, but we did not.
Yes.
All right, let me keep going here. Some supervisors, okay, good, we're getting to like a work environment here. Right?
Uh-oh.
Some supervisors refrain from words of praise and appreciation because they feel the people who work for them will presume one of the best bosses I ever had. Hold on. I'm getting stuck up on another hole punch. Sorry. Let me see. Some supervisors refrain from words of praise and appreciation because they feel the people who work for them will presume it's an O in something. I don't know. Okay. One of the best bosses I've ever said that a man who reacts badly to praise is no good anyway. So he encourages us with many words of praise and gratitude. And I don't know anyone for whom I worked harder. So I guess the main takeaway here is that supervisors should appreciate their workers more, because my grandpa worked hardest for the supervisor that praised him or gave him credit where credit was due. Let me continue here. How fine it would be if we would shake off the bonds of shyness or reserve and practice the lowly art of appreciation. Who knows what wonderful things might happen if we made ourselves into a one-man cheering section for those who are doing hard but necessary jobs and doing them well. Perhaps they may be almost ready to give up because it seems no one cares at all.
Last week, I saw a story on the news about how schools are always named for famous people, people who gave a lot of money or people who had position in the town or the state or even, the government or presidents. But this little school in Missouri, central Missouri, decided to name their school for the janitor. It was unanimous with the school board. The kids all agreed. The parents all agreed. The teachers all agreed that it should be named after her. The one who believed it should not have been her was her.
Right, because of her humility.
Yes. And so humility will take us a long way. And I think about if we became a one-person cheering section, that when we're with someone, we should always make them feel better about themselves before they leave.
And drawing from that story also, it makes perfect sense that the woman who the school was named after was the only person who doesn't agree with it. Because otherwise she wouldn't have worked that hard with that much integrity and her pure answer for the kids, right? For the kids. She would never have done that if she wasn't pouring out herself, the capacity of generosity.
Right.
She had no reserve.
No reserve. And she mopped floors, drove the school bus, and there was even a little clip of her answering the phone for the school, such as a school. This is the janitor speaking. And I mean,
he was not shy to label she's a janitor.
She owned
Yeah, I'm answering the phone, but here I am, the janitor, right? No reserve, no shyness, is who she is.
Just a great example in our modern time of something that your grandfather was talking about, 50, 60 years ago?
60 years ago, 1963. Let me continue on here. Surely the obstacles to self-giving in sympathy, affection, and appreciation are shyness and reserve, but its mortal enemy is the habit of fault-finding. And my grandpa felt it necessary to all caps, which by today's standards we know is yelling, but habit of fault finding, he capitalized. I'll continue. The word critic, in quotes, comes from a Greek verb meaning, in quotes, to separate. The true critic separates the good from the bad. He makes a value judgment, and his remarks may be wholly favorable and appreciative. It is a sad commentary on our proneness to condemn rather than to praise. That has given the word criticism a negative meaning.
Wow.
The habit of fault finding.
Habit of fault finding. In school discipline, I will have teachers ask, what do you do about the student that does X, Y, Z? And my response always is, are we waiting for and watching and waiting for kids to fail, or are we encouraging them to be as successful as they can possibly be? It's a whole mind shift in the way that we think of, because we imagine that these children should be perfect. And of course, we all know that they're not. But what are we looking for that encourages the goodness in them? And that is virtue. That's a beautiful statement about virtue. Fault finding. I love that phrase, fault finding.
And criticism, this is the first section where my grandpa felt it necessary to use a lot of quotes. I don't picture him. I don't think he did air quotes, but criticism or the word critic and the negative connotation that he's saying, it's not bad to criticize. Like in definition, criticism is judging. Like things should be judged. We're humans. We judge everything, right? But I guess it's not completely negative. Like in a sense, he thinks that we need the freedom to criticize, right? Like criticism, I will say, tends to sound and be negative, but I guess if I'm getting his point, it's that we shouldn't make a habit of finding fault necessarily, but we should still criticize.
Well, that's why we have movie critics, right?
Yeah.
And as an artist, you have a critique where people evaluate your work. I believe, though, the balance of finding fault in something and finding the good in it is where things balance out. That's where virtue lives.
So if anything, he's making a plea that criticism isn't only negative. Yes, it's negative, but let's not stop there. Like criticism, if I'm gathering, is also about appreciation. It's also about praise. I can be a critic and my judgment can be that it's worthy of praise, that it's worthy of admiration.
So make sure you say that before and after you criticize.
Right. Because if I don't, then it's fault finding. If my end is to find a fault, but criticism is to judge on what it is. Like it could be judged as bad, but it could also be criticized and judged as good. I think is kind of what his point is, right? Like we shouldn't make criticism fault finding.
Right.
That's the thing. We should stay away from that habit, capital letters.
We've come to call criticism feedback, or we've softened the word criticism to sound better. I like to say, yes, check-ins and things like that in restorative work, talking about helping kids.
Yeah. In the season of hope, I don't think there's much hope for the word criticism. I think the word criticism is just going to stay negative. Like my grandpa saw it in a negative context. I really don't think it's broken out of it. Sorry, criticism. Let me continue. Our critical faculty is tremendously important. Without it, we would have no standards of value of good or bad, better or best. But it is difficult to control. It is easier to see faults than to note good points. But when we look only for faults, we develop a hateful attitude underlined, which is the death of friendship also underlined, and love and affection and sympathy of appreciation of praise. My grandpa underlined a lot of things. Over criticism and fault finders annoy everyone and end up lonely themselves. He underlined more words in that paragraph than he didn't. This is the heart of this sermon. We're a little more than halfway through.
So did he yell, do you think, when he said that, the fire and brimstone?
At some point, we're going to have my dad on the show, right? And I think that's a question from my dad on that one. Yeah. So there you go. Essentially, he's saying that we need criticism because how do we know value? How do we know good, bad, better, or best if we don't ever allow, what's this line in here? A hateful attitude, which is the death of friendship. A hateful attitude. That's the first time I think attitude has come up in here as well as friendship.
Yes.
But I can definitely agree, and I think you agree by your laughing toward the end of it, that fault finders annoy everyone. Let me go on. Without stifling our true critical faculty, we can cultivate the grace of tolerance. We can learn to be friends and people despite their faults. In parentheses, which probably bothers us no more than others bother them. No doubt others may be too impulsive or affected, perhaps. This woman over-dramatizes herself, and this man is needlessly uncouth. Yet all of them need friends, and under the blessed influence of giving ourselves to their need, who knows what beauties of character they might develop. Whenever he's talking about, yet all of them need friends, it reminded me of a quote I heard recently. To have a friend, you need to be one. Yeah, to have a friend, you need to be. I took that to heart, and I think that's really what he's hitting on here, is that, yeah, I can acknowledge that people at times are over dramatic or uncouth, but I should be their friend anyway.
I think we have the opportunity in friendships to smooth out the rough edges in ourselves and in them if we truly are a good friend. A good friend is somebody that doesn't always take your side, but always accepts you for who you are, and you walk away feeling better about yourself.
And I love how it ends with, who knows what beauties of character they might develop. It's virtuous, because it's what I talked about, how it always includes someone else. And it may start in a bad spot, but the hope is that it develops into a better spot. And how does that do that? With us, with me willfully being a friend.
And that's where the unreserved part of the beginning of this sermon kicks in, that we cannot be reserved in our willingness to reach out and help people. I just think that is the idea of self-giving. We're giving beyond, and virtue enables that process. Virtue facilitates that in us, that we can go beyond ourselves and be generous.
Definitely. Let me continue here. We cannot remind ourselves too often that it is being loved that makes people lovable. John says this, I'm sure he's referring to John, the gospel writer, right? John was saying this as he spoke of God. We love because he first loved us. It was being loved by Jesus that made the disciples the great people they became. And Christ's command is that we love one another as he has loved us, that we give ourselves to others as he gave himself.
Think about how rowdy and a ruffian group of the apostles, that they weren't necessarily these wonderful, refined people that came ready to follow Jesus. They had to be shaped, but they were shaped by love and acceptance.
And the word rebuke, I think I only read or hear about in the Bible. To live with Jesus is almost unimaginable to me, but to be rebuked face to face by Jesus, out of love. Everything Jesus did, everything God does is out of love. I'm almost speechless thinking about what it would be like to be rebuked. But my point is that Jesus rebuked them. Jesus got angry. Jesus was both fully human and divine. Jesus did not obviously reserve anything. God poured himself out then and forever. So it's the best example of generosity. Of course, the sermon starts with John 3:16. And it really invokes for me the Christmas spirit. Yes, at Christmas, there's the narrative of the nativity. We think of baby Jesus, but powerful, willful, adult rebuking, right? Yeah. Yeah. The baby Jesus didn't really rebuke, or at least not that we know. But the power and the influence, the development, the friendship, the love that comes from knowing that Jesus is a criticizer, like Jesus is a corrector, right? Like to the people that God loves, all of us, we can expect correction.
I think in today's culture where people are being diverted from their truth of the faith and adopting it to the lifestyle they want for themselves and assuming that that's okay. I think it challenges us to think about Jesus standing to correct us. Are we willing to face that, or are we too self-absorbed and reserved to accept that?
Am I only tolerating the baby Jesus at Christmas time? Am I only tolerating the parts of my faith that are joyful and peaceful? Am I only taking those in, or am I taking in all of it? Am I taking in all my family and friends? Let me continue here. We got about a page and a half left in the sermon. To be sure, self-giving cost. When we get involved with another, we never know what may happen because of it. It is true that we never know for sure with our real friends who our real friends are until we get into trouble. Some who seem friendly become adept at keeping out of our way when we need them the most. It is those who are left who make our trouble their trouble, who are true blue friends. Those who give of themselves in our true time of need. The test becomes even more severe when we have done wrong, when only those who are willing to share our shame will stick by us. Preposterous, prominent, gifted, prosperous. Let me start. Prosperous, prominent, gifted people are always surrounded by those who are eager to be known as friends of the great. But Failures find that friends are few, and sometimes disgraced people look in vain for any friend at all. It got pretty poetic there. It's so poetic I couldn't even pronounce the P words. The allure of alliteration, right? There's definitely some alliteration in here. What's your take on?
Well, Jesus came to save the lost. I think about he cured illnesses. He was a friend of the friendless, basically, people that were rejected by society. Jesus took them in. And I think that sometimes that we want a cute church, a pretty church, and our lives are centered around the things that are, as you said before, we like to think about the baby Jesus, the goodness, but Jesus is in the mess. And I think sometimes we're afraid to get our hands dirty.
There's this line in the sermon, it is those who are left who make our trouble their trouble, who are true blue friends. You don't hear true blue friends anymore, but again, he definitely had a very poetic tone, or as far as I know, he wrote poetry. He was into art and crafting, scrapbooking and these things. So I love that line, who make our trouble their trouble. Or we talk about taking care of someone, taking care of their troubles, taking on their burdens as if they're my own, right? That's the tough, well, I was going to say tough love. That's the hard way to love.
And that really is compassion. Compassion is empathy with skin on it. That's my definition. And that we actually put ourselves to work and shoulder up with somebody who's suffering and take that on. And I can think of dozens of examples of that, but I love that line.
A true blue friend.
A true blue friend.
I'll read on here. There was a man in Galilee who seemed to feel that failures and disgraced people had a special claim on him. His own goodness was such that any conduct with impurity or evil must have been painful. Nevertheless, he became known as the friend of sinners. He let his life become burdened with the burdens of others, and he took their sins upon himself, cost what it may. He gave himself to all who needed him, and he would accept his giving. Hopeless folk, out of those faces joy and peace had gone, found they began to hope again in his company. Weak people who had stumbled and fallen so often that they had no self-confidence could now walk upright when he walked at their side. Lives that were twisted and spoiled became straight and clean in the alchemy of his love. The timid one learned to be brave from him. Sad folks learned to rejoice through him. And all who received from him became so changed that they could only describe themselves as being completely made over, born again, new creatures, and new creations through his self-giving.
Certainly describes the life of Jesus, doesn't it?
It's a very good synopsis.
Yes, it is. A beautiful synopsis of who Jesus was. But I love the idea that he started this sermon talking about self-giving and how timidity and reserve were the things that people, the holding back, and nothing was held back. Nothing was held back in this description.
He uses the word folks a couple of times in here, kind of sign of the time. But I think this is the first place he also uses hope.
Yeah.
Hope in here. Maybe not the first time joy, but this was in December. The sermon, like I said, December 17th, 1963. So it was the Christmas season then. People were thinking of the Christmas season. So I'm glad that the hope connection is definitely coming in there. I've got a little less than a page here. Let me read on. Centuries later, we too have come within the circle of his influence. In greater or lesser degree, we feel that he gave himself to us for us. And in greater or lesser degree, we feel impelled to give ourselves to him and for his sake to others. That is the central message of Christmas. It reminds us of the time when God so loved that he gave of himself, his son, that whoever believed in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Our hearts grow warm and tender as we think about God's wondrous gift to mankind at Christmas.
That's just, when we think about a baby, God knew the fate that that baby would suffer ultimately and still did it anyway. Talk about the ultimate self-giving.
And the recognition of how powerful our own will is. It's hard for me to look at Jesus as a personal example just because of the time and space, but also because I know me way better than I know Jesus. But what I have to convince myself is to stop thinking from my perspective, is to know that I am loved. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here, and that it's an active, it's an alive. Christmas is not a time when we just reinvigorate that love. It's a time whenever I recognize that love. That's, as a human, I don't believe that I'd ever be able to display that selflessness with my own regard. I think there's just too many things about the human condition, but it doesn't mean that I won't do my best to pour out myself, everything that I, without reserve, without shyness. No better time than Christmas, right?
Right. And think about, is it better to give than to receive, in the way that we respond? And I think people ask me what I want for Christmas. Nothing. Write me a letter. That's what I want for Christmas. I want a letter. But it's watching the joy in people and the interaction. And I can't remember more than a handful of gifts I've gotten throughout my lifetime, but I remember the spirit. And I remember the love that filled the room, that filled the place, that filled our hearts, that we all had that connection.
I'm envisioning him, this was, I guess, like a military chapel, but I'm envisioning it still with Christmas decorations, at least a few trees. In the 60s, they still decorated kind of like we do, right? They still go all out. So I can, it took him, like he waited toward the end to get to the Christmas message, and he does a great job, I think, of having the beginning, middle, end, and building his sermons. So I'm definitely feeling the Christmas spirit. I'll continue on. We got a few more paragraphs. But great gifts challenge our acceptance. A mean heart cannot receive a noble gift. A shriveled spirit cannot accept a generous love. Just as a big promise demands a big faith, so a tremendous gift requires a large acceptance. God gave himself to us. Will we accept what he offers? He offers us salvation, but we snatch at safety. He offers us joy, but we greedily grasp at comfort. He holds our love, and we take pleasure. He assures us of eternity, but we want a longer life. He gives himself, but we seize his material blessing. Isn't that kind of the crux of Christmas, in a sense, as we get a little too material about it?
I think in modern culture today, Christmas is seen as giving gifts. End of story.
An event.
Yes.
A one-day event. Maybe a one-night, one-day event, but it's like it lives and dies in the gift, in the presence.
Right. That's exactly right. And we don't think about Advent or that time of preparation. So many people I know go out the day after Thanksgiving, get their tree, throw it up, get all the decorations on it. And then the day after Christmas, it's gone. And actually the Christmas season begins with the Nativity. And so that idea of let's hurry up and celebrate and then clean up the mess and get back to business.
I like his choice of words here too, where he says, but we seize his material blessings. It's not like his is capitalized too. So material blessings are things. It's not like he's saying materials are bad, like this is good and bad and that's bad. He's saying, but we seize his material blessings. We choose material blessings over God-given blessings or gifts of God's self. You know, there's many of them. They're all over the place if you can acknowledge them, right? So I like that he doesn't just make it a black and white polarized thing here. He says, but we seize at his material blessings. He's acknowledging that there is goodness. God would not have created it if it was not essentially good. What's wrong here, what's disjointed, what is a lot of times what defines sin is not the opposite of something, it's the deviation. I appreciate that he didn't just say, this is good, this is bad. He said, we look at this whenever we should be looking here.
And I think if that's really looking at the gift and not the giver. And so we see the gift as something from the giver, the divine giver.
We don't separate them. We don't have to, but we put the giver before the gift. They're not separate.
Right.
It's just priority.
Yes.
So, all right, let me continue on. We got the gift of God, and all it means is not something that happened long ago or far away in Bethlehem. If our faith means anything, it must be the experience of still receiving Christ in our hearts, faith, and trying our very best to reproduce the divine generosity of God in our relationships with others. I still got a couple paragraphs, but I could have ended it on that like that. These are some great points, right? Didn't just happen in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago. It's alive today.
I think about God is timeless and intimate. So what you're praying for in your own life, and you're asking God for something, and I'm doing the same for myself, that intimacy of God knows us. He's closer than the air we breathe. And when we recognize that, it all comes together, because it is that timeless God. The same people that were praying 2,000 years ago had the same sense of presence of God that we have today, so many years later.
There's no expiration on eternal spirit, right?
Right. It is a beautiful thing. And even in our faith, we talk about communion of saints, and to actually be present in the sense of recognizing that the communion of saints comes together. That's where this relationship is restored with your grandfather, because the communion of saints, this brings him and the spirit of who he was into your life in a way that's profound.
And if I think about feeling and exuding the spirit of the season, wouldn't I want to do that with spirits? Not to get too hokey, but to say that people that I've known alive and people who've passed who have shown great example of the Christmas spirit. Let's just put Jesus on, Jesus is the reason. So I'm talking about the people who in their spirit and their willingness have and continue to make it the good season. So even though I'm kind of mixing metaphor and literalism here, the spirit of the season to me is getting in touch with alive people and past people who know about that spirit, right? To tap into that spirit. It's not tangible. It's not material. It relates to those things. To be definite about something intangible, to get into the spirit is about, well, who has that spirit?
Yes.
I've got two more paragraphs. Let me finish off this sermon here. John testified, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." That is the wonder of Christmas. But the real challenge of the day is for us to realize that his Spirit still seeks to become flesh and dwell among us. Christ desires to become incarnate again in you and in me. Jesus shut within a book is not worth a passing book. Jesus prisoned in a creed is a fruitless Lord indeed. But Jesus in the hearts of men shows his tenderness again. This is what God wants of us, to cradle the Christ within our hearts, and to have his Spirit work through you and me. The great Tolstoy wrote a famous story about a man who experienced a visit from the Christ child, yet he gave all he had prepared for the great guest to the needy people who stopped at his door. Tolstoy called that story "Where Love Is, God Is." The title is true, and so is the carol which sings, "Truly he taught us to love one another. His law is love and his gospel is peace." If we have not yet learned the loving art of self-giving this Christmas time, it is not too late. Let God in Christ be born anew within your heart.
Wow. Amen.
Amen.
I love the way he weaves his poetry into his sermons. That was a very poetic ending, just beautiful, and it really sticks. It really sticks.
Tolstoy must have been more popular at the time. Capital Tolstoi, in case I didn't pronounce it correctly. But
would that be Tolstoy?
Yeah, the Spirit's alive. Jesus shut within a book is not worth a passing look. Jesus prisoned in a creed is a fruitless Lord indeed. My grandpa was Methodist, and whenever I was reading the part where the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Spirit still seeks to become flesh and dwell among us. I'm thinking, because I'm Catholic, you're Catholic, I eat Jesus' flesh in the Eucharist. Methodists have a different understanding about that. The real challenge of the day is for us to realize that His Spirit still seeks us to become flesh and dwell among us. I see the Last Supper, the institution of the Eucharist, there, not to make a counterpoint to my grandpa, but I feel the fullness of faith comes in Jesus to be alive. I agree with him. He's alive in flesh. He dwells among us.
I think it's really an important thing when we think about that. Obviously, we have transubstantiation, believing that real transformation actually happens, that we are consuming the Jesus. But I think when we look at this piece of dwelling among us, that means that we are Jesus going out into the world, that our self-giving has to be as giving as Jesus was to us. That is, to me, the ultimate message that we can take from this, that I need to think about for the next few weeks.
For me to love with my whole heart, my body, my soul, with my mind, right? To God, the creator and the sustainer of all love. That's to live with blood pumping through me, understanding that this livelihood, this spirit I'm tapping into, that it's not something that I get for myself. It's alive.
And that's a radical Jesus. That is a radical faith. That pushes us out of our comfort zone and gets us out of the bubble that we live in with our family and our friends and the people that matter to us. That Jesus wants us to go beyond that, to love the unlovable and seek the lost. And that is really the ultimate role that Jesus asks us to play. This really gives me something to think about, especially now that we're having this podcast in this season of hope. Who am I bringing hope to? Not so much what am I doing with hope, but who am I bringing hope to? And how can I wholly give in this time of self-generosity?
Well said. Yeah, I'm definitely full of the Christmas spirit now.
I just am very grateful for this series. And for those of you that are listening, this is a beautiful book. It's a 5x7. It's a very tattered looking old 3-ring notebook, but it's not your general standard 8.5 by 11 size. And I was trying to wonder how he got these pages into his typewriter, and they didn't have whiteout at the time, and they didn't have spell check, but these are really well preserved. What a gift to your family.
I definitely cherish them. My dad said that his father, my grandpa, had a style of typing on the typewriter that looked like a court stenographer, that he was definitely like a plucker and a picker. I do that too. We have it so easy nowadays with our...
Oh my gosh. Well, could he have done this in AI?
Well, and I think about the importance that he put on himself to deliver a good message, knowing that the people who heard it will probably hear it once and never again.
Right. And might not even remember it.
I'm happy to do this. This is our first podcast doing this. We got plenty more where this came from. We're glad that you joined us for this first one. We'll have a new episode next month based on another sermon from Harold Whitlock, and hopefully I'll have some more of my facts straight on my own grandpa.
Well, I look forward to it. Having known your family for so long, and as you noted earlier, yes, I've known your dad longer than I've known you, but this is a very precious gift that's been given to you. To me, as a writer, I consider myself a writer. If people ask me what I do, I'm a writer. And to see something that's so meaningful in the written word, for me, it's a very precious gift. As I said, when I ask my kids, say, what do you want for Christmas? My first thing is, I just want a letter. I just want you to write me a letter. That's all I care about. And this is a beautiful gift to your family. So I can't wait until the next one that we have next month. Thanks for bringing this, David.
I'm glad to. Thank you to our listeners. If you like what we're doing here, check out the website, restorationmatters.org. We'll have this podcast posted there. Follow us and tune in next month. Thank you.
Thank you.